I'm Scott Loughlin. This is the Data Chronicles, and here are your data points. A term that is often thrown about is responsible use of AI. And the thing about that term is it makes sense, and it's also a place where it's really difficult to understand exactly what that means. Because frankly, there are different points of view about what is responsible and what is appropriate uses of artificial intelligence. And this comes back to a tension that we see over and over and over again on this podcast. Technology is advancing faster than our ability to govern it or even know how we would want to govern it. In fact, sometimes the technology is moving faster than our ability to even understand it. So today's discussion really sits squarely in that gap. And it's unique in this podcast. I often will have conversations and debates and spirited discussions with colleagues and friends throughout the data space. And one of the things that I would really love to do on this podcast is to bring some of those debates and some of those spirited conversations to a wider audience. Not necessarily to try to persuade anybody of the right way of thinking, but just to educate as to the various different viewpoints in the world about how AI is shaping what it is we do and what are the responsible ways that organizations may be able to use that. And in particular, for this episode, I wanted to focus on one key question. How should companies think about their roles with respect to the responsible use of AI? And in particular, where does the responsibility sit? With the designers, the users, the regulators, or is it spread out through everybody? And can, frankly, everybody agree on what would be responsible uses of AI throughout those stakeholders? To help flesh that out, or to at least provide you one point of view, have invited a friend, James Robson, who is the founder of Datum Longevius and formerly the data protection officer of the United Kingdom's Labour Party. As you'll hear, James has a strong point of view about what the role is of companies and the developers of AI in terms of their implementation of all of the benefits and their management of all of the risks. Importantly for everybody, this is just one point of view. There are others, and hopefully we'll have opportunities to return to this same debate. But I hope you enjoy the conversation to at least hear how some people are thinking about how to manage the benefits and the risks associated with AI. James, welcome to the podcast.
It's an absolute pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
So, James, I'm really excited to chat with you today because one of the things I know you're particularly passionate about is, how technology and ethics overlap, and in particular, how companies who are creating novel and really important innovative technology, how they should think about their role in deploying that technology from a societal perspective, from an ethical perspective. And that set of issues, I think, has really captured the attention in so many different areas, which I hope to explore. But maybe just start kind of, how do you see these two things coming together in today's day and age?
Feels like it is the question of our day and age, actually. I mean, when you have the likes of a Grok being investigated for creating sexualized images of children and women that are automatically posted onto Twitter, X, where does the line start and stop? And is that actually some sort of corporate responsibility over their own users, their own employees' use of social media. I mean, is that corporate responsibility for the organization within their policies and things? But if you think about the ethical uses of data, we really do rely on trust, because any rogue employee could just email the full list of salaries and benefits of all staff if they got hold of them, or if they were in a privileged position, externally to harm the organization, and maybe even to harm the individuals that they work with and work for as well. And surely there's like an inherent ethical responsibility from the individual as well. I mean, ethics and uses of data, I think, are becoming one and the same, similarly to legislation, because the best way that, I've worked with legislation is actually looking at it from a very, very ethical point of view. For example, my time as the data protection officer for the Labour Party, there would have been enormous consequences would we have lost the electoral register, the 42 million records of whether somebody has voted or not and their home address. And because we curate that in a way where we align a scored figure up against where they're going to vote, who they're going to vote for, Tories, Conservative, Green, Reform, any of those, surely that has detrimental consequences to the individual if we expose that. And there's an ethical reason for us not to do so.
That is, I think the right frame, because, you said a couple of things that are really interesting there, and ones I would want to kind of think about a little bit more with you and to kind of hear your perspective. One of the issues is, how is it that organizations think about the quote ethical uses of data or ethical uses of technology versus, what is quote lawful uses of technology or lawful uses of data? Because if you're going to put in kind of a level of ethical constraints that is likely to have some subjectivity to it. In other words, if we all agreed as a global society what appropriate ethics are, we would have probably gotten along much better than we have over the world of human history. And so my guess is that we're probably still not going to get along, even if you look at the political debates around technology. I think there's disagreement. And so if we are starting with that position where it's unsettled, I guess the question is, whose role is it to make those types of decisions around how technology can be used by individuals lawfully?
I think there's a bit of divergence in debate between, I guess, UK, EU, and US per se here. I mean, in my mind, it's the data protection officer, which also has the hat of, potentially the ethicist around the right uses of that data, to say, well, this goes too far. You're not allowed to use this to profile people and then sell that data in to a certain broker, for example. And we get into the whole kind of idea of potentially the ad tech industry that does monitor if you maybe click a cookie on a random website and you accept everything, then you do fall into the category in the bucket of having your data sold at auction very quickly for, yes, minute amounts, but still sold at auction for the advertiser to be able to know that you may be a potential customer of them and then show you the relevant information about their products or services and things. I mean, where's the ethics there? So I think, yes, in an organization, possibly the DPO, I think there's a security element in there. So Chief Information Security Officer has to take some sort of responsibility around protecting individuals from harm coming to them because of the uses of their data. But harm can also be extreme annoyance through uses of personal data. But of course, then I'm leaning on regulation and regulators as well. So the UK General Data Protection Regulation, absolutely, I think, is more of a kind of an ethical stance on uses of data, because if there was this kind of open access, open use of personal data, would be in a far more difficult realm than we are now, with how we think our data is being proliferated by threat actors to manipulate us into doing things or thinking things or voting a certain way or purchasing something. And it's quite interesting. I'm reading the book Identification at the moment that cites kind of numerous different ways that organizations will reduce the efficacy and the usefulness of a service that they provide to people. Because if they provide it en masse, then they're almost too big to change it and therefore manipulate it. So there's a bit of a dark pattern in there. They're locking you in and forcing you down a certain route to go to maybe the top supplier that they are aligned with rather than the one that may be more aligned to your needs and your requirements. So there's a lot of discussion about how to manage that. But yeah, it's a combination of it all. It's not a one size fits all by any stretch of the imagination, I think.
Yeah, I agree with that. But I think maybe the difficulties are that it always seems as though that there are competing interests, which in some ways become very political in nature and ideological, frankly, about kind of what is the role of humans to make individual decisions. Your point around, data security being an ethical issue, I think is kind of an interesting one in terms of, in the event, what is the impact to the individual in the event that there is a unlawful leak or breach of the information, and thus, making this a little bit more of a data security standard and turning it into an ethical conversation is one thing. I guess the other component of what you're describing is around the technology itself, right? And this is something that we have a lot of precedent for. There are organizations, companies who release technology to the world, and 99% of the time, that technology is being used just fine. And then 1% of the time, it doesn't. And the question in my mind is, are we in a position where the obligation falls on the manufacturer, the publisher, the supplier of this technology to control human decision making? Or is it really left to the humans to make sure that they are doing things appropriately? An example comes to mind, not being an expert in this space, but there's speed limits in the United States, traditionally like 55 to 65 miles an hour. There is no car that only goes 55 to 65 miles an hour. All of the cars go, well north of that. So if it were something that, the car companies were responsible for throttling how users speed on roads, then they could probably very well make it so that the car could not go as fast as they currently do. But I think as a society, we have not pushed that obligation on the automobile manufacturers, even though speeding has a detrimental impact on many people, including the loss of life. So my question is for you as you're thinking through this, why is it that technology providers on the internet, social media, AI companies should be seen any differently? Isn't it really the responsibility of the users to make sure that they are using this appropriately as opposed to the technology creators?
I think there's a degree of mutual responsibility between both. I mean, if you take your privacy in cars example, I mean, the moment that a car goes 56 miles an hour in the US, well, surely it has the technology to log you with the DMV and then issue a fine that could even get to you via email or text before you even got home. So, there are extremes that the platform providers, and let's even call the car manufacturers now a platform provider, because essentially that's what they are now. Take the whole kind of case that has just come about with Facebook. The fact that it's been found that there is a detrimental impact to people's mental health because of the use of Facebook and social media technologies that's been making its way through the courts as well. At what point is the right to ethical dials being used or implemented to protect people, maybe from themselves, but from harmful content as well. And, we had the whole purchase of Twitter becoming X by Elon Musk because the ethos of that was to ensure the freedom of speech was maintained for the planet. And there were theoretically too many people, maybe with what is being considered a woke agenda, curating the data in a way that it didn't allow free speech as well. So, all of these arguments and conversations have been going on over the last couple of years with us. So, and we're just kind of used to that. But then you are right. Where does kind of personal responsibility take hold in these conversations? I mean, is there an age limit? Is it mental capacity? How do you define that? Is there some other overarching force that should be watching all of our communications in every system that we use it, and then giving you a little warning sign to say, oh, you're going to hurt yourself if you're going to do this? I mean, maybe, well, in cars, we do have that. You do have the pop-ups that you may be going over 55 miles an hour the moment that you do it, and you have a little ping. I mean, for me, that really annoys me. Not that I've ever sped in the US, but to have that little ping, it's a bit annoying. Why can't I express my own free will with how I want to drive or how I want to use the internet or not? But then there's the prolonged exposure to things. Where's the ethics in that? And where's that line drawn? If you are of age, you are of mental capacity, you are watching things that could potentially over the long term cause you to have some sort of mental breakdown because they're so graphic and horrific, then at what point should you stop, or do you even know when to stop? And shouldn't there be a bit of a gauge in the social media platform just to go, we don't know who you are because that's how we've set this up, it's privacy preserved, but we're just giving you a warning here, you've seen 10 hours of this stuff, and we know because of XYZ reasons that this could be detrimental to your mental health, just to let you know, have a think about it. Where does that come into play, and whose responsibility is that? So, I'm not a proponent of being able to solve this on this podcast right now. However much that would be lovely, because I think you're right. It's a very, very difficult period that we're in, and we haven't solved it yet. And the solutions seem to be kind of blanket right now. It's either kind of blanket legislation one way, or it's technological adoption for limitation. Either I volunteer to have that blocker, or it's being forced upon me by a parent or some other caregiver. So there's many other things to think in there, and I want to come back on the concept of the cybersecurity chief even potentially having an ethical role, because what came up for me when you're saying that is, well, if it's not, then take away all the firewalls, take away all the infrastructure, take away all the safeguards around all the data that is processed by any organization, and see what happens. You'll suddenly walk out the door, and before you know it, it's being sold to somebody that feels that it has a monetary value for targeting or using that data against someone. Again, to either force them down a path to buy something, have a service, vote a certain way, think a certain way, nudge tactics to manipulate the way that we think about the world and our own feelings towards ourselves and things. I mean, we've even had an MP in the UK within the last couple of days decide to stand down from her role because of understanding there's an enormous problem with child sexploitation.
The ills of where this stuff, the technology can be used. I think there's no disagreement, and all of us would think that, hey, we have to do something. I think where there is misalignment is trying to figure out how and what to do to be able to address these issues. Even if you were to look at how some of these things have been addressed in the past, there has always been a concern around kids online, And so, call it rudimentary kind of approaches to trying to have age gates is, have say, oh, am I over the age of 18? Kids
Yeah.
are smart enough to be like, sure, if I just hit that button, then I can see whatever I want. If I hit the other button, then I can't, right? So it's not like they, are ones that are, don't understand like this is going to be the ways that they're going to be always be workarounds. And I think the same is always going to be true for even putting in much more sophisticated gating technologies, is that kids are going to, you know, and people are going to want to figure out how to get around it. And then they try to use other technology to get around that, and whatever limitations are put into place are usually ones then just affect the people who are uneducated about how to get around it. That to me, strikes me as that any type of approach of this, of saying, either we're going to legislate, or either companies are going to put in, their own specific policies. There can be debate about that. But to me, this still comes back to that there is a big digital literacy gap in our world, and that folks do not understand how the technology around them works, and importantly, how data is being collected from that technology and being used for a variety of different purposes that are not necessarily clearly transparent. That stuff can be very disclosed in, any number of privacy notices and, different things. And as you're describing kind of the ad tech system, there is a variety of ways where that comes out. But I think all of that is fine if the kids understand this, or if people understand it. If they don't understand the technology and they are just effectively consuming technology, they don't realize that in some ways technology can be consuming them. And that to me is really the challenge of our time. It's not so much to figure out how to get the regulation right, because I don't feel like the regulation is ever going to get right. I think that as soon as we start to come up with the solutions to these problems, it has to be about raising our general awareness and understanding about how all of this works, so that you understand what decisions you are making when you are using a specific piece of technology, and realizing that it is much more than just consuming some sort of content that you think is free.
Yeah, you make some really, really good points in there, actually. And I agree there is the potential for a massive literacy gap around these things. And what I found with, especially speaking to US based counterparts, is that I feel a more of a literacy gap in the US than there is in the UK and the EU, because of the legislation being forced upon us for the best part of 10 years now. We all understand what personal data is. We understand how things process that personal data, whereas there's still kind of lack of consensus or complete understanding, I think, in US circles around what personal data actually means and is. And so there really is this bit of gap there. But you're absolutely right. I mean, and I agree about the literacy gap, but and the tech consuming us point that you made, I think is a very good point, because our the tech that is consuming us is actually monetizing us and using us for remuneration to enhance their systems and their practices, to be able to coerce us to think things and say things and buy things. As I was saying earlier, we are the product. The now what seems like a bit of a cliche. Our data is the new oil, or the new money, or the new normal, it seems. And we've lost the ability to have that agency over our data with how those organizations use our data. We don't have a programmatically enabled, literate populace or public to be able to go, I'm going to press this button, and this will mean that I only allow the uses of this organization for this type of data for this period of time. Because all the things that you mentioned there, I was just thinking, the gates. We've got the Online Services Act, and we're trying to legislate that in the UK. And there's a bit of a hoo-ha around, well, how do you do that? How do you monitor those? And there've been kind of the age-gated restrictions on multiple websites that have popped up that have meant kids have suddenly worked out how to use a VPN very quickly to circumvent those. But all this stuff is programmatically, and you realize that societies don't necessarily, not all of them, but societies don't necessarily have a coherent and ethically managed birth to death identity life cycle. So if there is something illegal that may be accessed by a child, actually the moment that they access it, because whatever this big system that I'm thinking about would know it is that child trying to access this harmful material to them, and would just automatically block them from that. And I think that's the world we're getting to. But then, as long as we do trust the regimes that will be managing this for us. And there's a massive, again, a massive hoo-ha in the UK around the digital identity being, the ability for every individual to access government services and know each service to know who they are and they're accessing at different points and things, rather than being one big data lake that some, the government is going to use against you and try and make you vote a certain way to keep them in power. But how do we then have the checks and balances in place around the power structures that will have the authorities over those data lakes and the brokers and the dials around that? So we're in a really strange time right now, especially around all this stuff.
Yeah, those are really big and important questions. I guess the other thing that I would add to that is whether what you're describing is even possible, because I don't
True.
know that, I don't know about solving those big, huge questions at that scale with that level of coordination will be anything that humans have at least easily achieved, and have been able to sustain for long periods of time. And that's for very good reasons. People have different value systems, different ethical codes, different views about how to balance the roles of society and what's the role of government versus what's the role of the individual. All of those fundamental things get kind of shaken about here. And I don't know that trying to get agreement on any of those things it will be ever possible. But what I do know is that if we as a society don't realize that technology is really powerful, but it can be powerful in a good way and it can be powerful in a bad way. And you have to make sure that how is it that you can be able to leverage this technology to unlock its power and at the same time manage its risks. This is, in some ways, like, we don't go, if we would say, hey, we used to cut down trees with a saw. Well, the risk of an accident with a saw was much less than one with a chainsaw. And a chainsaw is really, really helpful, but it's also really dangerous if you don't use it correctly, right? That is something then you can see that, and it's obvious when you look at that tool itself. Technology is not necessarily so obvious in terms of how it can create these concerns. And just like you don't give a chainsaw to somebody who doesn't know how to use it, say, play around with this for a while. I think it's the same challenge for the rest of us to try to instill that training, that sensitivity, that sophistication into our younger generations who are using this technology in their day-to-day lives without necessarily understanding how it works. And then for families, for parents, for children, for whoever to make informed choices. It should still, in my view, still be a choice that people can make, but it needs to be an informed choice. And that requires a level of technology education that we don't often provide. I guess maybe my last question for you, James, is I think one of the things that you're doing is developing out your technology that is instilled with some of these ethical principles. And I think the question that I have around how you're thinking around the development of this is that, in some ways, I know companies have tried, and I think there has been some traction around competing on privacy, right? In other words, in a competitive marketplace, you have two companies. One is going to put resources in trying to implement privacy, while at the same time, probably restricting some of their business model as a result, versus others. My question for you is that something from your perspective that the market wants? Does the market want companies to be in a position to compete on those things? And in the end, if they say, hey, I'm going to spend $15 more on product X because it protects my privacy versus another company who doesn't, are they willing to spend $50 more? Or frankly, just do they want the $50 in their own pocket?
Yeah, I don't see embedding privacy into technology and organizations as being restrictive for them to have the ability to make money out of a product or service. I just don't. And I wholeheartedly think that's not the right conversation that those organizations should be having. I mean, the competitive advantage should be an individual says, well, you're going to protect my data or you're not going to protect my data. I'm probably going to go with the one that protects my data, because of the disadvantages that would come along because of the loss of my data should it not be protected in the right way. And I don't think that should be framed as a cost difference, in any respect at all. And so, I'm not a proponent of using it as a cost difference. I would say that was unethical as an organization to do that, to say, well, if you want it more private, then you've got to pay for it. I'm not a fan currently of the consent or pay models that have been adopted for media organizations, that mean you either pay with your data by accepting all the cookies that they're going to drop and use and sell about you to other brokers and make money off your data, or you pay not to have your data sold to other organizations. I'll be honest with you, I just click away from those sites if there's going to be that process. It's pay or pay. It's not consent or pay, and I think that's unethical, completely. And to come back to the whole kind of the literacy argument, no, I agree. There's bigger problems right now. You've got CEOs that are vibe coding, that are just thinking this is such a great idea of an application or a service that I'm building within this AI system that I can develop by just using normal language prompts, but without understanding the implications of where that data is going, how it's going to be used, why that might be bad, why it might be illegal as well, and then if there are problems with that code, they don't understand the code enough to be able to update that code, and then have to spend lots of money to have that recoded or unpicked because they don't really know what they're doing. And there's a lot of that right now. So another item that I definitely want to make a case about is that I think we can get to consensus. I don't think it's impossible. We've gotten to consensus to engineering standards globally. We've gotten to consensus to electricity standards globally. We've gotten to consensus on, flight standards globally. We can get consensus on personal data usage in ethical ways, as a global standard. But let's be honest here. There are charlatans and people who will cut corners to save a buck and make it seem like it's far easier to choose them than the competitor, and price themselves at a lower price point than the competitor because of those reasons. But there needs to be, again, it comes down to that literacy gap, even around privacy and privacy legislation, where I think there needs to be expectations on those organizations to do things ethically. And if they can't prove that they do, and we can do that programmatically as well, if they prove that they do, then that's the organization that I'm gonna use, and I'm not going to trust anything else other than the ones that can prove it programmatically to me. But how do you do that? Again, we're to the data literacy gaps, and we're nowhere near that place. So I'm not solving the world's problems by saying it can be done. I mean, we are miles away from being anywhere close to getting this level of consensus. But I think it has to get there. Otherwise, it turns into a real kind of free fall. And there was a really good quote that I heard that really got me thinking. Again, from a LinkedIn post the other day, like there should be data rights over data bytes. And without data rights of data bytes, we get to totalitarian regimes. I'm not completely convinced that we don't have rights over data bytes, we get to totalitarian regimes. I don't think there's an automatic correlation that way, but it really begged the thinking around, well, could it? And would it if we didn't get that right? And then how do you actually have rights over bytes? Isn't it a right over the use over a period of time and then a registered or recorded deletion that can be verified in some way? So, then there's many ways to skin this cat at the moment, and we haven't completely figured it all out. We don't have globalized standards around what we deem to be ethical or unethical. And interestingly, legislation that has come about is the EU AI Act, which does have some very serious implications on what ethical standards should be within AI. So surely we can all pretty much agree, and this is in that act, that an AI facial recognition tool registering my facial contortions to guess how I'm feeling about my employer should probably be illegal. And so therefore it is, because I may just be having a bad day. I may have found out my cat's died. I may just be going through some machinations in my own head. And it's not for my employer to interpret anything like that about my level of employment credibility and therefore fire me because of the contortions on my face. I think that's right. What we haven't done totally is gone like, well, where's the line for all of these things, and then how do we interpret this in through the courts to have the legal precedents to say, well, it went this way or that way, and how should it be moving forward? So we're going to go through all of that. That's really going to develop over the years. That's our future, I think.
I agree that those are going to be important conversations that we are going to have. My guess is that, there's not going to be a consensus at the end of those conversations, because, there's even, thinking about the various applications of these things is just going, in the end, going to find honest disagreements. You mentioned
Yeah.
kind of like the standards around having an electricity standard, engineering standard. Those are good points. There probably would be a general consensus that, we would love for, the media and social media to be reporting true things and not including disinformation. However, there is no consensus on what is disinformation and what is true and what is false. And there's a honest disagreements on that. And so trying to come up with ways of solving that legislatively, or putting companies in the position of having to decide it. We've tried that. Didn't sound like it went all that well. And now it's kind of left, back in the hands of, hey, you're going to read it with the view of the skepticism that you should deploy when you're reviewing things online, and don't accept it as being true. That is something that requires education. It doesn't require legislation. And, that in the end, I think is really the key in my mind. But I think the idea around, whether companies are going to, as you said, like, hey, I don't like, if it's going to be a consent or pay model, I don't go there. That is a competitive decision that you're making. You're deciding two choices. I'm only going to go to the ones that don't have that. And so there is some competition around privacy between those two competing organizations. What I don't know yet, right, is how broad of thinking that is, because even if you were to look at just the levels of people who accept cookies versus when there is no kind of penalty for not, it's still a high percentage. In which case, is that something that really matters to the day-to-day person? It's an empirical question I would be very interested in learning about one day.
You and me both. We're getting to other debates of our time, which is the facts versus opinion, truth versus objective truth, and what does that all mean? And history being written by the winners, and what about the other parts of history that we don't know about that may have actually been the reality of how our minds and our society was shaped. We just don't have all of that curated in a way where we've got, I don't know, some sort of blockchain of immutable kind of development, solve this thinking and why it went this way or that way compared to the others. And that's close to impossible as well, and close to impossible for anyone to do. What may be sad though is if you've got LLMs that are claiming that they've learned everything from the internet, and a lot of that is now in shitified internet, unfortunately, and a bit of a hellscape. Then, well, you can't get away from the biases, and you end up getting further away from where the history is probably, as close to the truth as the history can get. We may be getting further away from that for relying on AI bots and agents to tell us that as well. But then all I know is there is the ability to use data in a way that is enhancing an individual's lives to benefit them, to maybe pull them out of poverty, get them off the streets if they're homeless, improve their life if they are an abused victim of domestic abuse or child abuse, allow us to not put children in the line of fire of paedophiles, allow us to not give access to children to content that will harm them over the long term, and maybe traumatize them so they act that out further down the line, and move into criminality or drug taking or whatever is harmful to them. Data can be used for that stuff, and that's what I'm more excited about, the actual tangible realities rather than the intangible, fabricated or potentially not fabricated truths that we live in this sort of post-truth society right now. It's how do you give access to people that want to use that data to enhance people's lives, and you do it through a privacy preserved manner, like a trusted research environment, for then a policy paper to come out and the government to adopt it, that then has tangible, researched, evidence-based outcomes, that it's doing better for the society it was performed for. That's it. And that's what we should do.
Well, James, I think everybody will agree kind of on, all of those harms that you were describing around trying to figure out how to prevent them. I think the key question is how, and that one is going to be an area where it will be much more difficult to get that type of consensus. But James, I really enjoyed this conversation and the ones we've had in the past on this topic. I was really excited to have this conversation so that we can, discuss some of these real big, important challenges of our day with you. And for that, I appreciate your sharing your perspective with our audience today.
No, it's been fab. Thanks so much. Love talking with you.
With that, I'm Scott Loughlin. This is the Data Chronicles, and those were your data points.